Welcome to
Are
Tales by
Abuja,
Miss
city
A.
of power
Sit
and burnt
down,
stones.
relax, and enjoy the
Welcome
story.
to Story
Don't
with
forget to
Miss A. You think
subscribe.
folktales only happen under moonlight in the village? No. The most dangerous spirits today wear bespoke suits and drive SUVs with tinted glass. Tonight I'll tell you of Amara, a girl whose heart was as open as the Woos market, and Robert, a man who climbed a ladder he didn't build only to spit on the hands that held it steady. Listen closely, because in this city even the walls have ears, and sometimes the phone in your hand is the loudest witness of all. The call was
I'm
supposed
heading
to be a
home,
quick,
honey.
"I'm heading home, honey." Amara had smiled at her phone, hearing the familiar hum of Robert's car engine. She tapped the end call button, or so she thought, and tossed the device onto the kitchen island. But the Bluetooth stayed tethered. Through the high-end speakers she'd bought him for his birthday, his voice suddenly filled the kitchen, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. He wasn't talking to her anymore. "I've paid my dues, haven't I?" Robert was saying to someone on the other end. "I play the grateful husband, I thank her father for the job every Sunday, but I'm suffocating. Our marriage was the price I paid to get out of the trenches. It was a mistake, but it was a profitable one." Amara froze, a kitchen knife midair, as the man she loved described her life's joy as a business transaction. The Federal Secretariat was a labyrinth of echoing footsteps and the persistent hum of overhead fans that did little to stir the heavy afternoon heat. Amara walked through the corridors with the ease of someone who had played in these halls as a child. Her father, Chief Donald, was a man whose name opened doors before he even reached them, and as his only daughter, Amara carried that legacy in the graceful swing of her hips and the silk of her floral dress. She was there to drop off a lunch flask for her father, a small gesture of affection she maintained, even after finishing her master's degree. As she approached the heavy mahogany door of the director's office, she saw him. He was leaning against the peeling grey wall, a stack of files clutched to his chest like a shield. He wore the faded khaki of an NYSC member, but unlike the other corpers who lounged in the buttery, this man looked like he was vibrating with a silent, restless energy. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, despite the dust of the Abuja streets. When their eyes met, Amara felt a jolt, not of fear but of profound curiosity. He looked hungry not for food, but for a life he hadn't yet touched.
Who is that boy
"Who is
outside
that
your
boy
office,
outside your
Papa?
office, Papa?"
That is Robert.
Amara
He's from the
asked,
east.
setting the insulated flask on her father's desk. Chief Donald looked up from a mountain of memos, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "That one, Robert, a brilliant mind, actually, from the east. No long leg, no connections, just raw brainpower," the chief grunted, though his eyes softened. "He's been working late every night finishing the reports the permanent secretaries are too lazy to touch." Amara looked back at the door. She saw the way Robert stood, straight-backed, enduring the condescending tones of the older clerks. "He shouldn't be wasting away in a reception pool, Papa. Someone like that deserves a real seat at the table." Chief Donald smiled, a slow, knowing expression. He loved his daughter and he loved being the architect of people's fates. "If you say so, my dear, perhaps I'll see what can be done about his placement. Abuja is a city that eats the weak, but maybe this one has teeth." The transformation was swift. Within 3 months, Robert was moved from the general pool to the chief's private wing. He became the golden boy of the department. With Amara's father guiding his hand, Robert learned the secret language of Abuja power, how to speak to contractors, which palms to grease with a smile, and how to make himself indispensable. But it wasn't just the office. Amara began showing up more often, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with invitations to weekend gatherings at the IBB Golf Club. She saw Robert as a diamond in the rough, a man she was helping to polish. To Robert, Amara was the personification of the green card he had been praying for. She was beautiful, yes, but she was also the key to the heavy iron gates of Maitama and Asokoro. Every time she laughed at his jokes or touched his arm, he felt the weight of his poverty lifting. He started dressing in the slim-cut suits she recommended, driving the car her father helped him finance. He was no longer the boy in the starched khakis, he was a man on the rise. The proposal happened at the top of Catamp Hill, overlooking the sprawling lights of the city. The air was uncharacteristically cool, and the glow of Abuja below looked like a scattered box of jewels. Robert dropped to one knee, the diamond ring glinting in the moonlight. "Amara," he said, his voice thick with what she assumed was emotion. "You saw me when I was nothing. You and your family gave me a life I only dreamed of. I want to spend the rest of that life making you happy." Amara wept, her heart overflowing with the purity of her love. She saw them as a team, the princess and the self-made man. She didn't notice that Robert's eyes remained fixed on the city lights behind her, calculating the height of the next mountain he had to climb. The wedding was the talk of the town, a lavish affair at the International Conference Center, attended by ministers and titans of industry. As they cut the cake, Chief Donald leaned in and whispered to Robert, "I've given you my best treasure. Guard her well and your path will always be clear." It was a blessing that felt to Robert like a warning. 5 years into the marriage, the duplex in Guarimpa was filled with expensive art and a deafening silence. Robert was now a senior manager at a top-tier agency, a position secured through a final push from his father-in-law before his retirement. Amara lived in a world of blissful ignorance. She spent her days managing her boutique and her evenings preparing the home for Robert's return. She thought the distance in his eyes was merely the exhaustion of a successful man. She thought the way he flinched when she mentioned her father's health was just stress. She didn't know that every favor her father had done for Robert felt like a lash across his back. He was tired of being Chief Donald's son-in-law. He was tired of the gratitude he had to perform every single day. The resentment had grown in the dark corners of his heart like mold, unnoticed and toxic. He was waiting for a moment to breathe without feeling like he owed someone for the air. That moment came on a rainy Tuesday, through a Bluetooth connection he forgot to sever. The rain in Abuja that Tuesday was not a drizzle. It was a seasonal assault, the kind that turned the dust of the dry season into a thick, red sludge. Amara sat in their living room in Guarimpa, the scent of lemongrass candles fighting the dampness of the air. She was scrolling through her iPad, checking the inventory for her boutique, while the soft hum of the rain against the windowpane provided a peaceful soundtrack. Robert had called 10 minutes earlier from his car. "I'm pulling into the driveway, honey," he'd said, his voice sounding tinny and rushed. "The traffic at the Berger interchange was a nightmare. Just wanted to let you know I'm safe." "I'll have the pepper soup ready, love," she'd replied, smiling. She heard the heavy electronic gates groan open. She heard the crunch of tires on the gravel. Usually the Bluetooth connection in his sleek SUV severed the moment he cut the engine, but today the high-end home theater system she had gifted him for his birthday stayed active. A soft click-clack echoed through the living room speakers, the sound of him shifting the car into park, but not turning it off. Amara stood up to head to the kitchen, but a voice stopped her mid-stride. It wasn't the voice Robert used with her, that soft, polished tone of a grateful husband. This voice was jagged, weary, and stripped of all pretense. "I'm telling you, Chidi, I can't breathe in this house anymore," Robert said. The sound was crystal clear, vibrating through the surround sound speakers as if he were standing right next to her. Amara froze. Her hand, which had been reaching for a ladle, hovered in the air. She looked at her phone on the counter. The call timer was still ticking. 0842, 0843. He hadn't hung up. He must have hit a button on his steering wheel by mistake, or perhaps the rain had glitched the sensors. "Every time I look at her, I see her father's face," Robert continued, his voice rising with a sudden, sharp bitterness. "I see the man who thinks he owns my soul because he gave me a desk and a title. Do you know what it's like to live as a debt that can never be paid?" Amara's heart performed a slow, sickening roll in her chest. She sank onto a kitchen stool, the cold marble biting through her leggings. She should hang up. She should walk out to the driveway and knock on the window. But her fingers refused to move. The truth was a physical weight pinning her to the seat. "She's a good woman, Rob," a second voice, Chidi, Robert's cousin from the village, crackled through the speakers. "She loves you, her family made you." "That's the problem," Robert snapped, and Amara could almost hear him slamming his hand against the leather steering wheel. "They made me like a piece of furniture. Amara doesn't love me, she loves the project she built. She loves the fact that she rescued a poor pauper and turned him into a senior manager. It makes her feel like a god, but I'm suffocating under her kindness. Every 'I love you' feels like a receipt for a payment I never asked for." The words felt like shards of glass being forced down Amara's throat. She thought of the 5 years of smiles, the anniversary trips to Dubai, the way she had bragged about their perfect union. It had all been a performance. "So what are you going to do?" Chidi asked, his voice low. "You have the position now, you have the house, you're settled." There was a long silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers through the audio feed. When Robert spoke again, his voice was hollow, devoid of the anger, which made it 10 times more terrifying. "I'm going to keep playing the part," Robert whispered. "What choice do I have? In this city you don't walk away from the Okoro family unless you want to go back to the village with nothing. But let's be clear, Chidi, this marriage was the biggest mistake of my life. I traded my freedom for a comfortable cage. I don't hate her, but I don't want her. I'm just waiting for the day I'm powerful enough to finally stand on my own 2 feet and tell them all to go to hell." The line finally went dead. The speakers emitted a soft bloop as the Bluetooth disconnected. The silence that followed was louder than the thunder outside. Amara sat in the dim light of the kitchen, staring at the steam rising from the pot of pepper soup. The front door opened. She heard the familiar sound of Robert shaking his umbrella, the stomping of his shoes on the mat, and then his whistle, a cheerful, jaunty tune he always whistled when he came home. "Amara, babe, the rain is crazy out there." He called out, his voice returning to that warm, melodic register she had adored for half a decade. He walked into the kitchen, a smile plastered on his face, his eyes crinkling in that way she used to think meant he was happy to see her. He moved to kiss her cheek, but she instinctively flinched, her skin crawling as if a cold wind had just passed through the room. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowing in fake concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Amara looked at him, really looked at him. She didn't see the man she married. She saw a stranger who had been living in her bed, eating her food and hatting her family for 1,825 days. "I didn't see a ghost, Robert,"
I didn't see a
she
ghost,
said,
Robert.
her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "I just heard one." The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Robert's smile didn't falter immediately. It lingered like a mask losing its adhesive. "A ghost? What are you talking about, Amara? The rain must be getting to your head." He reached for a glass of water, his movements practiced and calm. Amara watched his hands, the hands she had held during their wedding vows, the hands her father had shaken when he handed Robert the keys to his first office. They didn't shake. He was a professional. "The Bluetooth, Robert," she whispered. The words were small, but they hit the room like a gavel. Robert stopped mid-sip. The glass stayed at his lips for a second too long. Slowly, he lowered it. The cheerful light in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. He didn't ask what she heard, he didn't deny it. He simply looked at the ceiling speakers, then back at her. The silence confirmed everything. For the first time in 5 years, the debt of his gratitude had been cancelled by the weight of his betrayal. For the next 3 days, the duplex in Guerimpa became a tomb. They moved around each other like ghosts in a haunted house. Amara didn't scream, she didn't throw plates. The shock had bypassed anger and gone straight to a freezing, hollowed-out clarity. Robert stayed in the guest room. He didn't apologize. To apologize would be to admit he was wrong, and in Robert's mind, he was a victim of circumstance. He still went to the office her father had built for him, wearing the suits she had curated. Amara sat in her boutique in Wusai, staring at the high-end mannequins. She realized they were just like her, dressed in the finest silks, positioned perfectly for the world to see but hollow and plastic inside. Her staff whispered behind her back. They saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way she forgot to drink her tea until it was filmed over with cold oil. She wasn't just grieving a marriage, she was grieving the 5 years she had spent as a character in someone else's survival story. Amara drove out to her father's house in Asakoro. The old man was sitting on his veranda, a shawl over his shoulders, watching the sunset dip behind the hills. He looked frailer than he had a month ago. "Amara, my light," he greeted her, his voice raspy. "Why is your face like a clouded moon? Has that boy not been taking care of you?" Amara sat at his feet, her head resting on his knee. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say, "Papa, the man you made hates the man you are." But she looked at her father's pride, the way he beamed when he spoke of Robert's latest promotion, and the words died in her throat. He's fine, Papa, just Abuja stress," she lied. Her father patted her head. "A tree that grows too fast often forgets the soil that fed it. If Robert is bending, it is because he has forgotten his roots. Remind him, Amara, a wife is the memory of a man's soul." Amara closed her eyes. She realized then that her father knew more than he let on. He had seen the resentment, he had just hoped love would drown it out. That evening, a formal card arrived at their home. It was an invitation to the annual civil service gala, an event where the elite of Abuja gathered to toast to their own success. Robert was to be honored as Young Administrator of the Year, an award her father's colleagues had lobbied for. Robert was in the living room when she returned, nursing a glass of expensive whiskey. He held up the card. "I suppose we have to go," he said, his voice flat. "The project son-in-law has to collect his trophy." Amara looked at him, her hurt finally sharpening into a jagged edge of rage. "Is that all I am to you, Robert? A social obligation, a rung on a ladder?" Robert stood up, towers over her, his shadow stretching across the expensive Italian tiles. You wanted a success story, Amara. I gave you one. I gave you the perfect husband, the perfect career, the perfect image. Don't act surprised that there's a price for perfection. We both bought into this. I didn't buy a performance, Robert. I offered you a life, Amara said, her voice trembling. You offered me a debt, Robert shouted, the whiskey sloshing over the rim of his glass. Every meal, every car, every promotion. It all came with the Donald stamp on it. I couldn't even breathe without wondering if your father approved of the heir. You didn't love me, Amara. You loved the idea of saving me. You loved being the one who found me. He walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers with a cold indifference. We will go to the party, we will smile, we will take the photos, and when the night is over we will decide if this mistake is worth continuing. Amara stood alone in the hallway. She looked at the wedding photo on the wall, the two of them radiant, surrounded by the power brokers of the city. She realized Robert was right about one thing: it was a performance, but she was tired of being the lead actress in a tragedy. She began to plan her own ending. The Transcorp Hilton was a sea of shimmering lace and sharp tuxedos. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and even more expensive promises. For the Abuja elite, tonight was the crowning jewel of the social calendar. Amara arrived on Robert's arm, her dress a masterpiece of emerald green silk that hugged her curves like a second skin. To any observer, they were the pinnacle of success. Robert looked every bit the young administrator of the year, his posture commanding, his smile practiced. But beneath the silk, Amara's skin felt cold. She could feel the weight of his arm on hers, not as a support, but as a tether. Every flash of a photographer's camera felt like a searchlight exposing a crime scene. She wasn't just a guest. She was the evidence of a transaction he was beginning to loathe. As they moved through the party, the greetings were scripted. Chief Donald's daughter, so beautiful, one minister's wife cooed, patting Amara's hand, and the brilliant Robert, your father-in-law, chose well. Amara felt Robert's grip on her waist tighten, not out of affection, but a subconscious flinch at the word chose. She watched him navigate the room, his laughter ringing out a second too late, his eyes constantly darting toward the exits. He was a man who had reached the top of the mountain only to find the air too thin to breathe. I need a drink, Robert muttered, leaning into her ear. His breath smelled of mint and a hidden, frantic desperation. Go, Amara said, her voice steady. I'll be with my father. She watched him walk away, his back straight, his head high. He looked like a king, but she knew now that he felt like a servant in a borrowed crown. Chief Donald sat at a reserved table near the stage, surrounded by his contemporaries, men who had built Abuja with their bare hands and backroom deals. He looked tired, his eyes clouded by the cataracts of age, but they sharpened the moment he saw Amara. You are wearing your mother's courage tonight, the chief whispered as she sat beside him. He didn't look at her jewelry, he looked at the tightness around her mouth. Papa, did you know? Amara asked, her voice barely audible over the live band playing a smooth high-life tune. Know what, my child? That a man who is lifted too high feels the wind more than the sun. The chief sighed, turning his gaze toward Robert, who stood by the bar, surrounded by ambitious younger men. I gave him the world, Amara, but I forgot that some men prefer to build their own dirt huts than live in another man's palace. I saw the hunger in him, but I didn't realize it was a hunger that could never be satisfied by kindness. The master of ceremonies took to the stage, his voice booming through the speakers. And now for the young administrator of the year, a man who has shown that with hard work, and perhaps the right guidance, one can conquer the capital. Robert Igwe. The room erupted in applause. Robert walked to the stage, the spotlight trailing him like a halo. He took the crystal trophy, his reflection shimmering in its facets. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze landing on Amara and her father. I stand here today, Robert began, his voice echoing through the hall, because of opportunities. In Abuja we like to say we are self-made, but we all know that someone somewhere held the ladder. He paused, his eyes locking onto Amara's. But there comes a time when the ladder becomes a weight. When you realize that the price of the climb was your own shadow. The room went silent, the thank you was missing. The gratitude was absent, it was a manifesto of resentment disguised as a speech. The drive home was a silent war. The rain had returned, drumming against the roof of the SUV with a rhythmic, punishing intensity. Robert drove fast, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. You humiliated my father tonight, Amara said, her voice dropping the mask of the dutiful wife. In a room full of his peers, you stood there and acted as if you were a victim of his generosity. Robert laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that filled the cabin. Generosity, is that what we're calling it now? It was an investment, Amara. He bought a son-in-law to secure your future. He bought a puppet who wouldn't embarrass the family. Well, the puppet has found his own voice. And what does that voice say, Robert? Amara shouted, her tears finally breaking through. Does it say that the last 5 years were a lie? Does it say that you hated every kiss, every touch, every moment of the life we built? Robert slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet asphalt of the Guarimpa Expressway. He turned to her, his face twisted in the dim light of the dashboard. It says I'm done paying interest on a loan I never signed for. I'm done, Amara. The sun rose over Abuja not with a golden glow, but with a harsh, unforgiving glare that exposed every crack in the marble floors of the Guarimpa duplex. Robert had not slept. He sat in the living room, his tuxedo jacket discarded on the floor like a shed skin. The crystal trophy sat on the coffee table, looking less like an honor and more like a cold, sharp weapon. Amara came down the stairs, not in the silk of a socialite, but in a simple cotton wrapper and a t-shirt. Her eyes were swollen, but her movements were deliberate. She didn't head to the kitchen to make his breakfast. She didn't check if he needed his shirt ironed for the Monday morning briefing. I called my father, she said, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Robert didn't look up. Of course you did. The princess goes back to the king the moment the servant stops bowing. No, Amara replied, walking to the window to look at the city she once thought she owned. I called him to tell him I am moving into the guest wing of his house, and I called him to tell him that he is to stay out of the process of our ending. No calls to your boss, no withdrawal of support, just silence. Robert finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of shock and suspicion. You think I'll believe that? You'll strip me of everything. That's how your family works. You give and then you take back with interest. You already stripped yourself, Robert, Amara said, turning to face him. You think the job and the cars are what made you. But I loved the man I saw in that starched NYSC uniform, the one who had nothing but a drive to be better. I didn't realize that man died the moment he got what he wanted. She began to pack a small suitcase. She didn't take the designer bags he had bought her with his salary her father's influence had inflated. She took only what she had brought into the marriage. As she walked toward the door, she stopped by the trophy. Keep it, she said. It's the only thing in this house that doesn't belong to my father. But remember, Robert, in this city, a man who stands on a mountain he didn't climb usually finds that the descent is much faster than the ascent. A month passed. The news of the separation rippled through the ministries and the high society parlors of Maitama. Robert expected the axe to fall. He expected to be fired, to have his car repossessed, to be cast out into the trenches, he so feared. But the silence from the Donald family was deafening. There was no retaliation. There was only absence. Without Amara to balance his sharp edges, Robert found that his colleagues didn't look at him with respect, but with a cold, professional distance. They had tolerated his ambition because he was one of them by marriage. Now he was just another aggressive manager in a city full of them. He sat in his large office, the air conditioner humming, realizing that while he had the position, he had lost the peace. He had wanted to be self-made, but he realized he didn't know who he was without the shadow of the man he hated. He was a king of an empty room. Amara sat on the veranda of her father's house, watching the rain once again. This time she wasn't listening to a shell or a phone, she was listening to her own heart. You look different, her father said, leaning on his cane as he joined her. I feel lighter, Papa. I spent 5 years trying to hold up a man who wanted to be a mountain. I didn't realize I was crushing myself in the process. A lesson learned in pain is a lesson that stays, the chief said. I thought I was giving you a foundation. I didn't realize I was giving you a burden. Forgive an old man for thinking money and power could buy a daughter's happiness. Amara took his hand. I forgive you, Papa, but I also forgive myself. I learned that you cannot love someone into being grateful. You can only love someone who is already whole. She looked out toward the Abuja hills, realizing that for the first time in her life she wasn't anyone's project. She was just Amara. So my people, that is the story of the call that never ended. We leave Robert in his cold palace of stone, realizing too late that a man who bites the hand that fed him often finds himself with nothing to eat but his own pride. And we leave Amara in the quiet of her own strength, learning to weave a life that doesn't depend on the gratitude of a stranger. Abuja is a city of heights, but never forget the ground you started on. Help is a seed. If you receive it with a bitter heart, the fruit will be poison. And to those who give, give because it is in your nature, but never mistake a person's need for their loyalty. A heart that is bought will always look for the exit. Be careful of the words you speak when you think the world is not listening. The ears of the ancestors are everywhere, sometimes they even hide in the Bluetooth of a car.